A man paid me $400 to write his late wife's obituary. The photo he sent me for it was my sister's face. My sister, who I thought had moved to Ohio with my husband 4 years ago for a fresh start. His name was on the payment before I even opened the attachment. Derek Weir. I hadn't heard it spoken out loud in 4 years, and there it was anyway, sitting in my inbox in 10-point font next to a dollar figure, like it belonged there all along. I should explain what my job actually is, because most people get it wrong. I don't write eulogies. Eulogies are for the people who loved someone. I write obituaries, which are for everyone else, the neighbors, the coworkers, the second cousins who will read 400 words at a kitchen table and decide, based on nothing but my sentences, whether a stranger's life mattered. The dead don't get the last word. Whoever's left to write it down does. I had been the one writing it down, professionally, for 3 years. I did not expect, on a Tuesday in March, to be handed the job of writing it down for my own sister. My name is Nora Finch now. It was Caroline Weir for 6 years before that, and Caroline Larkin for 26 years before Weir got attached to it, and I have spent the last 4 years being very deliberate about which version of myself answers to which name. Derek and I met in Pittsburgh, married at 23, and for a while I believed the version of my life where a steady man with a good job and a habit of remembering how I take my coffee was the whole prize. I found out otherwise on a Sunday in October, 4 years ago, when I came home 11 hours early from a work trip and found my younger sister's coat on the hook where mine usually hung. Iris was 23. She cried more than Derek did, which I've had a long time to sit with and still don't know what to do with. I don't remember driving home that day so much as I remember standing in my own kitchen afterward, still in my coat, listening to the two of them talk in low voices upstairs like I was the guest in the house instead of the wife. Derek came down first. He didn't apologize. He said, "This isn't how I wanted you to find out," like the finding out was the injury, not the 4 months of Tuesdays that came before it. I moved out that night and stayed with a coworker for 6 weeks while I figured out what a life looks like when you take the one you had and cut out its 2 main characters. I did not do it gracefully. I have never told anyone, not even Ray, about the 2 months I couldn't walk past a bakery Iris and I used to go to as kids, or the year I flinched every time someone said my sister's name in a grocery store, thinking, absurdly, that it might be about me. They left for Ohio within the month. Nobody called it running away. Derek's firm had an opening in a satellite office and Iris needed, everyone agreed, a fresh start somewhere. Nobody knew her as the girl who did that. I stayed in Pittsburgh exactly long enough to watch the 2 people I trusted most build a new life 60 miles over a state line, and then I left too in the other direction, and became somebody who had never met either of them. Becoming Nora took 18 months and less imagination than I expected. I kept my own middle name because changing everything felt like admitting Caroline Larkin had done something wrong instead of something to her. I let my hair grow out gray at the temple instead of coloring it, because Caroline never would have, and small rebellions were the only kind I had energy for left. I picked Finch because it was my grandmother's maiden name, and because birds, I decided somewhat sentimentally at the time, were allowed to leave a place without anyone calling it abandonment. I never signed divorce papers. Derek never sent any. I told myself for a long time that I was too proud to chase him for a signature, and I've only recently started wondering if the truth was closer to the opposite. That some small, stubborn part of me liked knowing there was one document in the world where I still existed as somebody's wife, even if I never wanted to be his again. I kept one other thing from that life, tucked in the bottom drawer of my desk under a false bottom of unpaid invoices, a folder of obituaries I've written for people who are still alive. My grief counselor suggested it, back when Derek and Iris were fresh wounds instead of old ones. Write the ending you're most afraid of, she said, so it stops writing itself in your head at 3 in the morning. I wrote one for my marriage. I wrote one for Derek. I wrote one, the worst night of all of them, for myself, 400 words about a woman who used to exist and stopped being interesting enough to keep around. I had not opened that drawer in over a year. I opened it the night Derek Weir's $400 landed in my account, because some instinct in me said the 2 documents belonged in the same conversation, even if I couldn't yet say why. I am good at this job in a way that still occasionally surprises me. 2 months before the Weir file landed on my desk, an elderly farmer's widow outside Caldwell called Vera's office in tears, because the county papers template had listed her husband's occupation as simply retired after 51 years running the same 300 acres, and I spent an afternoon on her porch listening to stories about a man named Walt until I had 400 words that made her laugh out loud twice while she cried. That's the part of the job nobody warns you about. You become fluent in loving strangers just long enough to send them off properly, and then you let them go and do it again for someone else the following week. My editor, if you can call a woman who runs 3 small-town papers out of a converted feed store an editor, is named Vera Alcott. Vera has been syndicating my work to 6 counties in southeastern Ohio for 3 years and has never once asked why a woman with a journalism degree and a clean employment history wanted to write about dead strangers instead of school boards. She's 61, allergic to small talk, and the only person in my new life who's ever looked at me like she suspected there was an old one underneath it, without ever once asking to see it. She assigned me the Marietta job herself out of a stack of a dozen requests that week, and told me only that the family wanted someone careful, someone who wouldn't rush it. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count since. The email from Derek was 3 lines. Wife's name Caroline Weir. 51 years old, I am 30 and Iris would have been 27, and neither of those numbers is 51, and I stared at that line longer than I stared at the photo. Cause of death, listed simply as an accident on County Road 9, he wanted it published by Friday and wanted, in his words, nothing dramatic. Just the facts. She wasn't complicated. She was the most complicated person I have ever loved, and he'd reduced her to 4 words like a receipt. I took the job. I told myself it was for the money, which even at the time sounded like something I was saying for an audience that wasn't in the room. It was not for the money. I've never once, in 3 years of doing this work, needed a reason beyond the one already sitting in my inbox. Somebody I used to know had died, or hadn't, and either way I appeared to be the only person left who was going to ask which. I drove to Marietta 3 days later under the pretense of confirming details in person, a thing obituary writers almost never do and family members almost never expect, which is exactly why nobody stopped me from asking. The funeral home was small, family-run, the kind of place with a coffee urn that's been running since the Reagan administration, and a director, an unhurried man named Pete Marsh, who'd buried 3 generations of most families in that county, and had the peculiar gentleness of someone who'd stopped being surprised by grief a long time ago without everyone's going numb to it. He let me look at the intake paperwork without asking many questions, the way people do when you carry a clipboard and speak in a calm, professional voice. The paperwork said Caroline Weir. The photograph paper clipped to it was Iris, unmistakably, down to the small scar above her eyebrow from a bicycle accident when she was 9 and I was 12, and it happened, technically, on my watch. There was a second document behind it, a copy of a driver's license, Caroline Weir, my middle initial, my birthday, close enough that only I would catch the year was wrong by 2. Iris's face, Iris's crooked smile that never quite committed to either side. I set the clipboard down on Pete's counter more carefully than the moment probably required, the way you handle something you're afraid might be contagious. I had spent 4 years being a woman who left. I had not, until that exact minute, considered the possibility of being a woman who'd been quietly kept, on paper, long after she thought she'd gotten away. I did not, that afternoon, understand yet how deep the fraud went. I only understood that somebody had built sister a version of me to die inside of, and that Derek Weir had paid $400 to make sure the world never asked why. I met Ray Sutter 2 days after that, in the only diner in Marietta that stays open past 9, though I didn't know his real reason for being there until considerably later than I should have. He introduced himself as a magazine writer working on a piece about the vanishing craft of the small-town obituary, which was, he told me later, a cover story he'd used exactly once before and hated every time, because it required him to actually be interesting about typography and deadlines for 45 minutes before he could ask a single real question. I found out much later he'd read 3 of my published columns before he ever walked into that diner, which either makes the magazine writer's story more convincing or considerably less forgivable, depending which one of us you ask. You wrote the Weir obituary, he said, sliding into the booth across from me without asking, which should have annoyed me and somehow didn't. It hasn't run yet. I've got 2 more days on the deadline, I'll live. Take the extra day, he said, and there was something underneath the casualness of it, some weight he wasn't putting down yet. Humor me. I asked him what a magazine writer cared about a stranger's deadline for. He told me, straight-faced, that good writing takes time, and ordered a coffee he didn't touch for 20 minutes, and I decided I liked him before I had any good reason to. It took him 4 days to tell me the truth, and when he finally did, it was in the diner parking lot, both of us standing by my car in a cold that had teeth in it, like he wanted the option of walking away mid-sentence if it went badly. "I'm not a magazine writer," he said. "I work special claims investigations for Buckeye Mutual Life. There's an $800,000 joint policy on a Pittsburgh couple named Derek and Caroline Weir, taken out 9 years ago. A claim got filed on it 11 days ago. In 6 years doing this job, I have never seen a cleaner, faster, less grieving fraud than this file, and I was sent here to find out whether the obituary writer was in on it or just useful to it." I remember being angrier in that moment than I expected, not at the lie exactly, but at how easily I'd let myself enjoy 4 days of a stranger's attention without asking why he was so interested in a small-town obituary in the first place. "So which is it?" I said. "In on it or useful?" "I don't know yet." He said it like it cost him something. That's the honest answer, and I know it's not a good one. "You don't know because you haven't figured out my angle, or you don't know because you like me, and you're hoping I'm not part of this." "Both," he said, and didn't look away when he said it, which is the only reason I let him keep talking instead of walking to my car right then. "My name is Caroline Larkin Weir," I told him, 4 years since I'd said it out loud, and it came out steadier than I expected, like a muscle that had never actually forgotten how to work, just hadn't been asked. "Derek is my husband. Legally, apparently, still. The woman in that casket file is my little sister." Ray didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he reached across the space between us and turned my coffee cup, which I was still holding, absurdly out here in the cold, a quarter turn, so the handle faced my hand instead of his, a small, unnecessary, entirely deliberate gesture. "Then I think," he said, "we're both about to have a very different week than the one we planned." We ended up back at that same diner 2 nights later, less because we needed the coffee and more because neither of us wanted to keep having this particular conversation alone. Ray ordered a slice of pie he didn't finish and asked me, apropos of nothing, what Caroline Larkin used to want to be before Pittsburgh happened to her. "A marine biologist," I said, "age 9 through roughly 14. I grew up landlocked and stubborn about it." "What happened at 14? "I found out you needed to be good at chemistry." I turned my fork over twice. "What about you? Did 8-year-old Ray Sutter dream of insurance fraud?" 8-year-old Ray Sutter wanted to be a weatherman. Mostly for the pointer stick. He said it completely straight-faced, and it took me a full 3 seconds to realize he meant it, and somewhere in the laugh that followed I noticed I hadn't thought about Derek Weir's $400 in almost 10 minutes, which felt, that week, like a genuine accomplishment. We spent the next several days building what Ray called, generously, a picture, and what I would have called, less generously, the architecture of exactly how thoroughly my old life had been erased and repurposed. The Washington County Recorder's Office keeps insurance beneficiary filings on microfiche older than either of us, and getting to the relevant reel took Ray flashing a badge that technically only worked, because the clerk on duty that morning didn't look closely enough at the expiration date. We sat in a windowless annex for 3 hours scrolling through 9 years of amendments to the Weir policy, and somewhere around hour 2, I stopped being able to tell whether my hands were cold from the building's ancient air conditioning or from watching my own name get typed, retyped, and quietly kept current on a document I had never once been asked to sign since the year I left Pittsburgh. "You'd think," Ray said, not looking up from the reel, "a policyholder who vanishes for 4 years would trigger some kind of review. You'd think a lot of things about how carefully anyone checks on a woman once everyone's decided she left." He looked up at that. He didn't say anything kind, which I was grateful for, because I don't think I could have taken kind just then. He just nodded once, like he was filing the sentence away somewhere he intended to use it, and went back to the reel. Derek had never filed for divorce because an active marriage kept the original policy from lapsing into a cheaper, unassignable one. Iris, without health coverage of her own after leaving her job in Pittsburgh, had been added to Derek's insurance under my name within the first year, a decision Ray's records showed Derek had made alone, on a form Iris's signature appears on, but that a handwriting analyst Ray knew for a favor said, off the record, "Look, coach. 4 years of prescriptions, checkups, and 1 emergency room visit for a broken wrist, all filed under Caroline A. Weir, all quietly building a paper trail that, on the night Iris's car left County Road 9 in the rain, made it administratively easy, not forgivable, but easy, for Derek to walk into the county coroner's office and identify his wife. He didn't fake your death, Ray said, laying it out across a motel room table that had become, without either of us quite deciding it, our office. He just never let you be undead in the first place. Everything since is him cashing that in. I asked the question I'd been circling for a week. Did he do something to her car? Ray was quiet longer than I wanted him to be. The county ruled it weather and road conditions. I pulled the file. There's nothing that proves otherwise. He paused. There's also nothing that proves she wasn't leaving him. He showed me the last thing that came off her phone before the county recovered it from the wreck, forwarded to him by a records clerk who owed him a favor from a case 2 years back. A text sent at 9:47 that night to a number that turned out to belong to a woman named Priya, a coworker from the pharmacy where Iris had been quietly working nights under her own actual name for 8 months, the one place in 4 years she'd apparently been fully, unfraudulently herself. I'm leaving tonight. Don't tell him, I'll call you from the road. There was no reply. There hadn't needed to be one. She'd already been driving when she sent it. I called Priya myself 2 days later, against Ray's mild professional caution about contaminating a witness, because some things aren't about the case. She picked up on the second ring and went quiet for a long moment when I told her who I was. She talked about you, Priya said finally. More than you'd think. She kept your old work badge, the one from before, from Pittsburgh, in the pocket of her work apron. I asked her about it once. She said it was the last thing that still had her sister's actual name on it, instead of the one she'd been wearing like a coat that didn't fit. I hadn't known Iris still had that badge. I hadn't known until that phone call that my sister had spent 4 years quietly grieving a version of herself too, in a pharmacy 60 miles from where either of us used to be real. She was going to stay with me, Priya said, just for a few weeks, until she figured out the rest. She had a backpack packed in her trunk. I don't know if anybody ever found it. Nobody had mentioned a bag. I wrote that detail down and did not tell Derek it existed, because it was not his to know, and because I had started somewhere in that phone call to understand I was not only writing an obituary anymore. I was building a case for who my sister actually was, against a man who had spent 4 years insisting she wasn't complicated at all. I drove out to County Road 9 by myself 2 days after that, without telling Ray, because some things you have to do without an investigator's careful eye deciding what counts as evidence. There wasn't much to see. A stretch of guardrail newer than the pavement around it, a curve that didn't look like it should have killed anyone, a scatter of weather-beaten silk flowers zip-tied to a fence post that I recognized, with a jolt, as the same cheap grocery store book Iris used to buy for both of us every February, because real flowers, she always said, were a scam invented by men who forgot the other 11 months existed. I stood there a while in the cold and didn't cry, which surprised me less than it might have 4 years ago. I have gotten very good, in this job, at being the composed one in the room. I have gotten less good, I realized standing on that shoulder with cars passing close enough to stir my coat, at knowing what to do with grief once nobody's paying me to sit with somebody else's. I left my own flowers before I drove back. Not silk, I don't know why that felt important, it just did. I sat with that for a long time. My sister had taken my husband and then, 4 years and 1 broken identity later, had tried to take herself back from him too, in the rain, on a county road alone. She almost made it. I don't know what almost making it is worth. I've decided some days that it's worth everything, and on other days I think that's just what I need to believe so I can keep breathing. Derek called me twice that week, still under the impression he was speaking to a hired obituary writer named Nora Finch and nobody else. The first call, he wanted a progress update and asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I'd need a family photo or if the one he'd already sent would do the job. I asked him, as neutrally as I have ever asked anything in my professional life, how long he and his wife had been married. 11 years, give or take, he said, which was true and which was also the exact length of my own marriage to him down to the season, and I understood in that moment that he wasn't lying to me so much as he'd simply stopped bothering to keep his 2 wives straight in his own head, 'cause in the only ledger that mattered to him, they'd always been the same interchangeable line. The second call, when I asked, carefully professionally, whether he had a preferred phrase for how his wife had spent the last several years, he said, I'm not paying you to write a novel. 400 words, no editorializing. She wasn't that complicated, and hung up before I could answer, which was for the best, because the answer I had ready wasn't professional at all. That was the moment I stopped being careful. Not loud, not dramatic. I just closed my laptop, looked at Ray across the motel table, and said, I know what I'm going to write now. Ray's supervisor pulled him off the case 4 days before the funeral. Officially, the claim had been escalated to a different regional office and a junior adjuster reassigned. Unofficially, Ray told me, flat and furious in a way I hadn't seen from him yet, Bucky Mutual would rather quietly deny a payout and avoid fraud trials publicity than actually prosecute a policyholder who might sue them back for bad faith if the case went sideways. Derek, separately, must have felt some version of the same pressure closing in, because his lawyer sent a letter to Vera's little feed store office that same week, citing emotional distress and threatening a defamation suit if the obituary I'd been hired to write contained, in the lawyer's phrase, any unauthorized speculation about the deceased's personal history. Vera brought the letter to my desk herself instead of mailing it. She stood there while I read it, arms crossed, and said, before I could ask, I gave you that job on purpose, if you're wondering. We're Marietta. I did the county courthouse beat for 11 years before I bought this paper, and Derek Ware's name came up in a probate dispute back when you and I first started working together. Nothing I could prove, nothing I could print, just a feeling that never left. I didn't know about your sister. I didn't know about you. I just knew I wanted somebody thorough on that file, and you have never once turned in a lazy sentence in 3 years. She tapped the letter. Write whatever's true. I'll take the lawsuit. I did not feel as brave as Vera's speech deserved. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes, running through every version of the next month, where I simply mailed Derek his 400 words, cashed the check, and let a dead woman keep wearing my name in peace. It would have been easier. Nothing about grief requires you to also be the one who exposes the person profiting from it. I thought about the bag in Iris's trunk instead. Nobody had ever found it, or if they had, nobody had thought it worth mentioning to the sister she'd been trying to reach when she died. I went inside and opened the locked drawer and read, for the first time in over a year, the 400 words I'd once written for myself, a woman who used to exist and stopped being interesting enough to keep around, and understood finally exactly what I owed the sister who'd spent her last 4 years living inside that exact sentence too. I had at that point no functioning investigator, no institutional backing, and a cease and desist letter with my editor's name on the envelope. I had a drawer full of endings for people who were still alive, and I had 400 words still owed to a man who thought he'd bought my silence for $400. I decided the 2 documents had always belonged in the same conversation. I just hadn't known, until then, that I was the one who'd have to finish writing it. I wrote the true version of Iris's obituary the way I write every first draft, longhand, in the same spiral notebook I've used since this job started, sitting at my kitchen table with the locked drawer open beside me for the first time in a year. It took most of one night and all of the next morning. I crossed out the word victim 4 separate times. I kept the word sister every single time it wanted to leave. I did not send Derek a copy. I did not ask Vera to fact-check it, though she would have, gladly, at any hour. Some drafts you only get to write once, and you write them for the one reader who'll never get to read them back. The funeral was small, 30 or so people in a chapel that smelled like carnations and old carpet, Derek in the front row in a suit that fit him better than grief ever had. Pete, the funeral director, had, at my quiet request the day before, listed the reading of the obituary on the printed program, which nobody in that room but Vera and Ray, who came anyway, unofficial off the clock, standing at the back in a coat that wasn't warm enough for March, understood was unusual. Derek found me in the vestibule 20 minutes before the service, still believing I was simply the writer he'd hired, and told me to keep it short because people don't need the whole biography, they need to get to the reception. Up close for the first time in 4 years, he looked smaller than the man who'd lived in my memory. Same haircut, same watch, a stranger's version of someone I used to know the exact weight of. He did not recognize me. I let him not recognize me for 11 more minutes, the last 11 minutes I would ever spend being invisible to him on purpose, and I found I didn't want them back once they were gone. I stood at the small podium beside a casket with the wrong name on the temporary marker, and looked at 300 words I had not shown to Derek, because they were not the 400 he had paid for. Her name was Iris Larkin, I said, not Caroline. Caroline is my name. I'm the sister everyone here was told moved away and stopped speaking to this family. I didn't stop speaking. I was never asked to start again. The room did the thing rooms do when the ground moves under people who thought they were standing on something solid. Derek was on his feet by the second sentence. Pete, gently, and with more strength than his unhurried voice suggested, put a hand on his shoulder and asked him, quietly enough that only the front 2 rows heard it, to sit back down and let the woman finish. I told them who Iris actually was. 27 years old, worked nights at a pharmacy under her own name because it was the only place in 4 years anyone had called her Iris and meant it. Loved bad reality television and good coffee and used to fix my bicycle chain every single time it fell off, which was often, because I never learned to do it myself. She kept a work badge from my old job in her apron pocket for 4 years, the one with her sister's real name still printed on it, because it was the last object she owned that told the truth about either of us. I told them she had been using a driver's license with my name on it for 4 years, not entirely by her own choosing, so that a man in the front row could keep an insurance policy active on a wife who'd stopped being his wife in every way that mattered years before she stopped existing at all. I told them she had sent a text at 9:47 the night she died, to a friend, 4 words long, "I'm leaving tonight, don't tell him." I did not raise my voice. I have read 1,000 names out loud in 3 years of doing this job, and I have never once let my hands shake on a podium, and I did not start that day either, even though everything in my chest wanted to. "The dead don't get the last word," I said, closing the pages. I've believed that for 3 years professionally. I believe it a little differently now. Sometimes the living don't get it either, not until somebody's willing to stand up and take it back for them. This is Iris's. I'm giving it to her. Derek said my name once, low, disbelieving, like a man reading a word in a language he used to speak fluently and had let himself forget. I did not look at him again after that. I looked at the casket instead and said the only thing I had left that wasn't for the room. "I'm sorry it took me 4 years to come back for you. I'm here now." Nobody clapped. It isn't that kind of room. But Pete stepped forward, with the same unhurried authority he'd used on Derek earlier, took the podium back from me just long enough to announce, to 30 stunned faces, that the family had asked for a short recess before continuing, which was not true, and which was the kindest lie anyone told that day. Vera found me in the vestibule and didn't say anything at all. She just took the folded pages out of my hand before they could shake themselves loose and held them, and me, for exactly as long as I needed and not 1 second longer, which is its own kind of professional courtesy, coming from her. Ray stayed at the back of the room the whole time, coat still on, and didn't move toward me until Derek had been walked out by 2 of his own cousins, at which point he crossed the chapel in about 4 steps and said low, "I'm sorry I wasn't officially here for that." I told him he'd been exactly present enough. Bucky Mutual's fraud unit opened a formal investigation within the week, helped considerably by a funeral home director willing to testify under oath about a driver's license photograph that didn't match a name and by a pharmacy coworker named Priya who still had the text thread on her phone. The claim was denied. The Ohio Department of Insurance referred the file to the county prosecutor for identity fraud and insurance fraud within the month. Ray, reinstated once the case became too well documented for Bucky to quietly bury, told me the brake lines on Iris's car were overdue for service by 11 months, per Derek's own maintenance account records, a detail that didn't prove anything in a courtroom but proved, to me, everything I needed to know about the kind of husband he'd been to both of us. Derek kept his job for exactly 9 days after the arraignment. Marietta is small enough that 9 days was generous. The hardware store 2 doors down from his old office still has, taped inside the front window facing the street, a photocopy of the newspaper page that ran the real obituary next to a short news item about the fraud charges, and Vera tells me nobody's asked them to take it down yet. That was 5 months ago now. I buried Iris a second time in June, quietly, under her own name this time, on a hillside outside Zanesville close enough that I visit more Sundays than not. I had the old obituary transferred properly, corrected, filed the way it always should have been, and I keep a copy of the real one, not the fraudulent one, in the same drawer where the fake ones used to live. It is the only document in that drawer written for someone who actually died, and it is the only one I have never once wished I could take back. Priya drives up from Marietta, sometimes to visit the hillside with me. She brought the trunk bag eventually. Ray tracked it down through the impound lot untouched for months, a duffel with 2 changes of clothes, $40 in cash, and a paperback Iris had dog-eared to page 40. We didn't need it for the case by then. I asked to keep it anyway, and Priya, without needing to be asked why, said of course. I go by Caroline again mostly. Nora still signs the syndicated column because Vera says the byline has built its own reputation these last 3 years, and I'm allowed to keep something that's only ever been mine. I like that I get to choose now instead of hiding. I still write obituaries for strangers every week. I am better at the job now than I was a year ago, though I couldn't tell you exactly what changed, except that I no longer flinch at the phrase survived by, the one every obituary writer learns to place carefully, because I understand now, in a way I didn't before March, that surviving somebody is its own complicated relationship, and it doesn't end just because the obituary does. Ray drives up from Marietta most Fridays, officially because Buckeye Mutual still has him consulting on the aftermath of the case, unofficially because neither of us has found a polite way to stop this yet, or particularly wants to. He still turns my coffee cup a quarter turn before I've picked it up, handle toward my hand every single time, like he's checking whether I've noticed yet. I always have. I've just lately, let him do it anyway. Last Friday he asked if Nora Finch took her coffee the same way Caroline Weir used to. I told him I'd let him know once I decided which one of us was answering. I don't keep drawers full of endings for people who are still alive anymore. I didn't need the practice. I already know how the good ones sound. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.